The Chargers make the playoffs for the first time in Herbert's career. They fall short with the third worst collapse in postseason history. What are some needs that the Chargers have to build upon to be better than what they were this season?
Well, there's a few things that I could factor in. If I were to list just three in no specific order, let's go with number one. Number one, they have to improve their interior defensive line. So when we talk about the Chargers defensive line, obviously when you first look at it, you immediately think of somebody like Khalil Mack, Joey Bosa. Like those are your edge rushers. Those guys are phenomenal when they're healthy. Unfortunately for both of them, they had some injuries this year and they weren't as effective that I think the Chargers wanted them to be. But interior defensive line, they have to improve. And Kev, when we were talking about this before we started recording, the Chargers had one of the worst defensive rushing units in the entire NFL. They were like bottom of the barrel bad. They were like 27th, 28th in rushing yards allowed. And that was despite the fact going into this past season, there was a lot of hype and a lot of excitement about all the acquisitions that the Chargers had made defensively. And people were legitimately thinking that the Chargers could have a top 5, top 10 defense. And there were just games last year where they just got absolutely destroyed. I remember against the Jaguars last year, the Jags go on the road to SoFi and just blew the Chargers out of the water. And that was before James Robinson ended up getting traded to New York. James Robinson ran all over that team. And that's just one game in particular. There were multiple games where the Chargers, they just could not stop an opposing offense's running attack. So that's something that they're going to have to improve in the draft, maybe focus on in free agency this offseason. That's one area of concern. My second area of concern is their wide receiving depth. When it comes to their wide receivers, look, the first two guys, they're solid. You got Keenan Allen, who's been in the league. He's a seasoned vet. I mean, Keenan Allen's one of the better wide receivers in the league. It's just unfortunate that it seems like injuries tend to plague him year in and year out, and it limits his effectiveness. But despite that, I mean, Keenan Allen's one of the best route runners in the game. He's always able to get separation. Mike Williams is a great deep threat as their number 2 option. But then after that, it gets a little weak. And we saw this year in particular when Keenan Allen and Mike Williams are not in the fold, there's a little bit of a weakness in that wide receiver room. So overall, you got Josh Palmer, who's solid, but when he is inserted into that number 1 wide receiver option, when both Keenan Allen and Mike Williams aren't able to go, he's not really able to rise to the occasion and display those types of performances that Keenan Allen and Mike Williams are capable of. So maybe they look into the draft to maybe just bolster that part. And it's unfortunate just that injuries plagued the Chargers this year in their wide receiving core. I think if they had stayed relatively healthy the entire year, this wouldn't really even been an area of concern for me. But the fact that it was, and that some of these guys just couldn't step up in their respective roles, maybe the Chargers will look to that this offseason. And then my last point that I want to make is this has more to do with coaching personnel. We have to see better play calling from the Chargers offensive coaching staff. And, we could look back to the Jags game in the wild card round where they just got off to this amazing start and then they just completely fell apart in the second half. Like, that was a game from an offensive coordinator perspective that they flat out failed. They couldn't protect Justin Herbert. They didn't get the ball out quickly enough because the Jags pass rush was getting after him, especially in that second half. And as far as I see it, your offensive coordinators, your offensive play callers have to put your quarterback and the rest of the offense in a position to win. And there were too many times last year where, quite frankly, I don't think that the offensive play calling was appropriate in certain circumstances, in certain drives, and in certain situations. And this is something that I think is going to be an issue moving forward. Because when we look at Brandon Staley, he's somebody to me that could potentially be on the hot seat going into next season. And if things don't improve dramatically for the Chargers next year, there could be some rumblings about him potentially getting fired. And, granted, they did make the playoffs this year, which is a step in the right direction. But I got to see some better play calling, and I have to just see overall better performances and better play calling selections from their offensive coaching staff going into next year. If they don't improve that, then I think they're going to have a very similar result compared to this past season. They may make the playoffs, but they may get bounced out in the first round. And I think this is one of those situations where they got to take that next step. They have to elevate and potentially compete for a divisional round. And if they really play their cards well, maybe even an AFC Championship game. But those are my three aspects that I think the Chargers need to address. They definitely need to improve their interior defensive line. They have to improve their wide receiver depth, and they have to get better play calling in their coaching staff, specifically with the offensive side of the ball. But Kev, I'll let you take it from here.
So I completely agree with everything that Kyle said. I'm just going to point out maybe two more things really quick because I don't want to repeat what he said. I would say that the Chargers also need to improve their tight end room. Outside of Everett, they don't necessarily have a blocking tight end or someone that's going to go create separation. I mean, Everett was great on third down. Everett was great as being a safety blanket like most tight ends are. But in terms of what the Chargers are known for over the last 15 to 20 years, they had Antonio Gates, they had Vincent Jackson, they had a lot of big bodies. And Everett isn't somebody that screams as a threat, even if you're somebody that's more hybrid, like a Hayden Hurst for Cincinnati, right? Somebody like that. You're going to need somebody that can go out there and create some separation, get you some space. You're not going to get a Travis Kelce every draft or a George Kittle, but you have to find a way to kind of expand the tight end room there. And then I'm going to go into linebacker. At linebacker, you have Van Noy, Tranquil, Khalil Mack, and Michael Davis. Outside of that, outside of Tranquil, Van Noy's more of a pass rusher, not someone that's going to go out there, drop into coverage and make a play, not someone that's going to wrap you up in the middle of the field 15 to 20 yards. Tranquil had a couple of good plays this year. I believe he had 95 total tackles and 5 sacks, so he emerged later as the season progressed as someone that can play better. But Michael Davis, Khalil Mack missed some time this year. Joey Bosa missed some time. Again, those are more of pass rusher, but again, since they classify as linebacker, you are going to need a little bit more depth. I would tie edge rusher into that because when Khalil and Joey missed time, obviously at that point, that means that the majority of the pass rush for the Chargers kind of just disappeared. I mean, Joey had 2.5 sacks this year. I believe Khalil had maybe, what did you say earlier, Kyle? I think like 7 or 8. So, I mean, if you combine those two totals, that's 10.5 sacks. The Chargers had, 40 this year? So, I mean, like that's a fourth right there between two players. Once, God forbid, players like that go down, you have to have somebody that's going to be able to pressure the quarterback. Again, I know that the Chargers were middle of the pack in that regard, but if I had to put a third, I would say backup rushers, backup people that can get to the quarterback and create a problem for the opposing offensive line. But for me, again, like I said, that's got to be the tight end room. It's got to be the linebacker room. And then for me, if I had to put a third one, some depth behind Joey Bosa and Khalil Mack, who we know have unfortunate history with injury.